Sub-Saharan Africa, part two. We're picking back up. If you're just coming in, if you're just going out of order and being a deviant, not watching these things in order, not following the rules and whatnot, we just talked about some animals dying naturally, crossing a mighty river in Africa that might have had a result of climate change, crossing a river. So we're back on that. I'm still stuck on that, but we're moving on. Sub-Saharan Africa part two, like usual, globalization and development, some human aspects of things. There's going to be a lot of text on some of these. Some mining happening here. But Sub-Saharan Africa has been a commodity-dependent region and geographic area. And what that means, that's economic dependent. So we're talking about that kind of dependency. Their economic dependence on exports of agriculture and mineral raw materials of sorts. And so we know what that means. We've talked about this from the introduction. When you rely on agriculture or greater and more broad and even sounding more fancy, extractive or primary economic factors and those extractive properties, pulling things from the land, if you remember, if you can't remember back, we've talked about it since. If you rely on those things, your economy is not diverse and it's certainly not very strong. And so that's a problem for Sub-Saharan Africa and other areas around the world, of course, because we've talked about it. But it continues to be a problem, especially for an area that's rapidly growing as well. So they have to actually also rapidly diversify their economy as well, and which we're doing. We're going to get to that. But it has been commodity dependent, and it still is largely, but we're getting there. So that's where things have been and things kind of still are, but we're going to keep moving. Since the year 2000, kind of a little dated statistic, but that's what we were working with. It's already about 18 years old, probably. That statistic is already as old as many of you, perhaps. Many African countries have made substantial efforts to diversify their economies to become less vulnerable. Well, that just solves exactly what I just said, as if I didn't move to that next point. So since 2000, a lot of these places have been fixing the critique and the concern that we just had for them. And this is a fair point. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But first, we're going to go way back in time. 1884, 1885, the Berlin Conference. You're going to need to know about this a little bit outside of the exam, perhaps in an essay or something. Organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany. Perhaps then it should ring a bell. I hope you know that the capital of Germany is Berlin. Perhaps many of you did not know that. I don't know. Maybe you did know that. Let's just say you did. Great. Berlin, Germany. Organized by first Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck. 1884, closed in 1885. It's a conference. What's this conference going to do? Well, it heightened colonial activity in Africa. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about that. This is a cartoon. Obviously, it's sort of showing what colonialism has done to the African continent. Countries go in, they take what they can get, they get rich, and it sort of leaves not much left behind. That's enough explanation on that. Should have been self-explanatory. Picture worth 1,000 words. It's heightened colonial activity in Africa. There was a scramble for Africa. I think that's what a lot of people call it, scramble for Africa. And what this conference did is it actually served as a formal process of that scramble for Africa. So let's talk about it on the next slide. Yes, we will. Just looking ahead. But let's address this point. 14 countries sent representation. These are countries from Europe, empires, some of them, Austro-Hungarian Empire or something, or the Turkish Empire, Germany and others, Belgium. No kidding, though, the United States goes and has a seat at the table. And they have the right to approve of it or disapprove of it or whatever, but they're just there hanging out. They're not claiming up land in this, but they're there because we're always there. Something going on in the world, we seem to always be not far behind. But so the United States is involved. We're watching. 1884, 1885. So we have 13 countries that are trying to get a power grab into Africa. They're scrambling up. This is an area to be colonized. We've already been colonized in other parts of the world, sometimes for hundreds of years. We got plantations going in Haiti and stuff for sugar and such. And we got a lot of places that there hasn't been anything formally done here. And so we got a lot of land to cover, second largest continent, and we got to go and establish our presence there. And so these 13 countries participate and sort of want some land. The United States just comes and watches for some entertainment, I suppose. Obviously, it's not that simple. I'm not, but we kid. So colonial exploitation, not a good word. Before the Berlin Conference, this is where we're going to talk about a little bit of the Berlin Conference. Before the Berlin Conference, much of Africa was being used for private resource extraction. So what's that mean? We have a continent of Africa, and it is there, and there's tribes there that have been governing themselves for many, many years. And the Europeans, some go in. For instance, let's take Belgium. We're going to pick on them for a bit. King Leopold II goes in, and he establishes the Congo Free State on his own authority. And he goes in there and he's like, I want the diamonds and on some of these other extractive properties. And he goes in there, takes all this money and resources that can't be found in Europe. Meanwhile, exploiting the land and exploiting the people that are there. And that's fine. It actually goes so badly for Congo, because the Congo Free State and this area, because he's such a bad guy. He's so destructive that people have to step in and say, well, wait a minute, this is, even though we need to make our money, this is some pretty far out stuff. So Belgium takes over, overseeing this as a colony, and that's what I mean, this scramble takes place. We have places with, obviously, because I unfortunately don't want to say it that, like the collective we, but there's been an extraction of human resource, human capital from the African continent for the purpose of slaves in the New World for some time now. So we have places that have little outposts, but now we're actually going to talk about forming borders, and we're going to construct borders, and we're going to actually form colonial territories. And so what that did, the Berlin Conference, it started to parse out, forget tribal areas, and we just started to carve out places of who wanted what. And we know that Belgium got the Congo 70-some plus times larger than its actual country back in Europe. We know that the French got a nice swath of land in West Africa. The British took places here and there. The Germans, the Italians, the Portuguese, and we carved up Africa. Again, we, this collective we, we're just speaking as an example. I didn't do it. You didn't do it. And so they carve up Africa. And that obviously leaves some conflict, as you can imagine. Imagine if we come in and somebody just starts to carve up Florida. Maybe a little different, because you might not care, but nevertheless, things are different when it's organized as if your family had different places and your tribes that have been governing themselves for a lot of time, and places that are perhaps your enemy. So European powers reaped large amounts of money in Africa from natural resources not found in Europe. No surprise. Later, we're going to fast forward like 100 years, okay? So we go from 1880s, from Berlin Conference, to 1980s, structural adjustments. Remember the SAP, structural adjustment programs? They're no good, from the IMF and the World Bank, and it's usually these belt-tightening measures, giving the money with strings attached, as we know, which usually hurt some social safety programs and stuff like that, were forced upon the African nations in the 1980s, nearly 2 decades after many of them were granted independence. A lot of these granting their independence around the 1960s, give or take some here and there on that side of that. Whoop. Look at this guy. The informal economy. We're going to say IF for that, break it down. Sub-Saharan Africa rapidly grew after the structural adjustment programs. The informal economy grew in Sub-Saharan Africa after structural adjustment programs. Jobs in the informal economy account for 2/3 of all jobs in Sub-Saharan Africa and 90% of all jobs for women in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this informal economy, like transportation in this sense, or some selling of small goods and services, other things that we've talked about with informal economy in various sectors in Middle and South America, even in Russia, where it accounts for quite a large percentage as well. Usually in areas with a little bit more unstable larger economies, this takes place. So approximately 40% of the GDP, gross domestic product, of Sub-Saharan Africa are from jobs from the informal economy. So a huge spot. And obviously not a majority here, but a very healthy minority of the economy. And so that's very important to understand. who has work and what they're doing to make a living, and how that stabilizes a country as a whole. Current era and diversification. We're finally getting that diversification we called for. So renewed interest in Africa's development has left a more promising future. We don't have that same mentality of just taking and leaving isn't there, although still exists, of course, but not to the same level, to the same extent. That mercantilism that the colony has to only produce for the mother country, for the colonial power. We see relationships that are more mutually beneficial now through trade deals and others, but more mutually beneficial, not mutually beneficial yet. We still have to get to that point of fair trade, or better trade that we talked about at the very, very beginning. That might sound familiar. Investment in infrastructure and communication technologies has begun, and it's done quite well to develop the continent and emerge. Chinese, and to a lesser extent, Indian investments have helped Africa to develop with telecommunications and infrastructure, and so again, that diversification finally can occur. We can't have a really strong manufacturing and things like that if we don't have the means to be able to ship things to and from places through rail or roads and things like that. So we're working on those kinds of things, and certainly still has to come. Power and politics. Divide and rule, the deliberate intensification of divisions among people by potential rulers, divide and conquer, but not in this sense of defeat, but to divide and rule. So to control the people, you divide them, you point out differences among them, and you keep the people pitted against each other to distract them for a while you're ruling, or to keep them weaker than the one state. Lack of transparency has certainly plagued African governments for decades. This level of hiding things and level of corruption is certainly a problem for Africa, and it's still a problem in today's world. Certainly working on that, but definitely one of the larger problems that face the political establishments in many parts of Africa, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa. Ethnic tribes continue to incite conflict in the region. Remember, these tribes that have been governing themselves are all of a sudden neighbors, and they're in the same country, and we're supposed to believe. Now, the book used an example of Nigeria. A lot of different tribes, a lot of different languages happening in Nigeria organically. They come in and they draw it and they parse it up, give it to some countries, and now all of a sudden you're supposed to be Nigerian together. But you might not have identified as that before. You would identify it among your tribe, among your language, among your extended family. And now you're supposed to share a nation state together. But remember, a nation state is one that sort of is relatively homogeneous. These are certainly no level of homogeneity here. And so that causes some problems within a country, and that pokes and prods at that level of stability that should be there if we want to see these countries become a little bit more stable. When your economy is unstable and your politics are unstable, and yet your people have instabilities among them because of long tensions from colonialism, and rightfully so, it creates some sort of perfect storm for some level of chaos that they've certainly overcome in a lot of places. Some geopolitics. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, based in Somalia, it's certainly active elsewhere, a terrorist organization, and we know Boko Haram in Nigeria, famous for kidnapping many women some years back, sometimes linking to the Islamic State or ISIS. Only 11% of the world's population. The region has 28% of the world's refugees, 75% women and children, a major, major problem. And some refugees are attempting to escape forms of genocide, which we know is the purposeful destruction of human life based on some criterion. Recent and rapid growth. So in 1960, only one sub-Saharan African city had a population over 1 million people or greater, Johannesburg, South Africa, and we certainly now see that number is going to be quite larger with tons of cities, several million people. And so from 2015 to 2050, one city in particular, Lagos, Nigeria, is expected to double its population from 12 million people to 25 million people. It's unfathomable. Well, it's actually not unfathomable. We're putting it down, and we have to imagine it because it's actually happening. So, but it's quite hard to wrap your head around that the city can grow that large in just that short period of time. It's already quite large, and remember, cities like New York and things, already at this size, is going to be double that. So primate cities, remember these sort of key cities in a particular place, the city of economic or political control of a country, sort of the main city. Primate cities are booming. However, West Africa is experiencing greater levels of uneven migration than that of East Africa. Continuing at the recent and rapid growth, urban slums account for 72% of the African population, a major, major problem. We know when a country grows, we'd link this again to Brazil. We don't always have to link things to Brazil, but because we covered it first, we'll talk about the favelas and the urban slums. We talked about this in North Africa, and it counts here as well. And these are slums as defined by a larger institution. Some, again, varying levels of what exactly a slum is. Infrastructure and access to potable water, potable is healthy, safe drinking water, has not kept the pace of the rapid urban growth. And so we have different ways of storing water because it's not necessarily accessible at all times for all people. And food security has fluctuated in the region due to access and other complications. As cities grow, it's more and more complicated for the same amount of agricultural output to reach them effectively. Okay, back. Population growth in Africa is beginning to slow. Current total fertility rate in Sub-Saharan Africa is 5 births per woman. Why? What does this mean? Well, I don't have the answer in front of me, but we know what this is. I pose this question as a rhetorical question, but because it actually relates back to what we talked about in North Africa and Southwest Asia. Why is it beginning to slow? More women being educated, more women taking the workforce, a diversification of the division of labor that's taking place, a modernization of contraceptive use. Again, a lot of these different factors that all come to play that starts to slow this. When you have the infant mortality rate that's slowly going down, that's how many children don't make it out of their young years. People obviously have a lot of kids because they don't expect a lot of them to make it to adulthood, which is quite sad. But when those numbers go down, and babies are being born healthier and are living, we don't have to have as many children to rely on that type of preparation. And so all these sort of factors and many more go into the individual level decisions of why women aren't having more children, but sort of a larger theme there. The population and public health, with a lot of health things to talk about. Infectious diseases account for 50% of all deaths in Sub-Saharan Africa. That is a lot. An infectious disease to still kill that amount of population shows some very troubling ideas at play because we know chronic diseases, things like cancer, heart disease, and things like that are killing people in the developed world, as we would call it, the developed world versus the developing world. And obviously that status, that stamp of developed and developing would vary from region to region, of course, but it's 50% to be dying from infectious disease is quite poor. Trypanosomiasis, African sleeping sickness, is a disease that continues to plague the region, in particular Sub-Saharan Africa. Mosquitoes, malaria of the Anopheles gambiae mosquito, dengue, Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, all of the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Mosquitoes that come from the African continent. Aedes aegypti is in the United States, and we would be swatting at it here in the United States. It came through the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, way back when. These diseases all have origins to the continent of Africa, and they infect tons of people all around the world. HIV and AIDS, we know, is a big problem, and perhaps you even associate HIV/AIDS with Sub-Saharan Africa. 26 million infections in Sub-Saharan Africa since 2015. Not even making this list was the 2014 Ebola crisis, which originally came in the 1970s in the Congo area, the Ebola River, named after it. That's why we capitalize Ebola with a capital E, because it's named after a particular place, and that's how we do things with that. And only harmed a few people. We had 10,000 people killed through multiple countries in West Africa in 2014 from the Ebola crisis. Zika, coming from the Zika forest in Uganda, capital Z. Dengue, malaria, chikungunya, yellow fever, diseases that aren't named after a particular person or place or a proper noun, so we don't see the capitalization there. Just a little fun fact for you to know. Sociocultural issues. Gender, division of labor between men and women for domestic activities and agriculture. We know that When men go and seek living in the cities, women take over all of agriculture, in addition to their domestic activities in and around the home, inside the home specifically. And so that gender division of labor exists in Africa in a very traditional sense, yet in some contexts very different. The practice of polygamy still exists in this region, which predates some of the religions that have moved in through missionary work of the colonial empires. Female gender mutilation, or FGM here, which is a definition here that's found in the book, and the book spends some time talking about it. The removal of the labia and clitoris, and sometimes stitching together the vulva completely closed, and what that's done for. Again, this is something that predates the religions here in the region. Both of these two things we would sort of think as we would perceive as perhaps maybe more backward, although polygamy more widely accepted around the world. Certainly this one is a human rights violation, female gender mutilation, female genital mutilation. That should be female genital mutilation, not gender. Caught an error. A 2006 study conducted that female genital mutilation victims are 50% more likely to die in childbirth, and the child also very high at risk. It is present or has been documented in 27 countries in this area, and it's now illegal in 16, so we're certainly making progress on that. Remember, I'll catch that little mistake. You'll see it uploaded properly on the slides on Canvas, but again, this practice very devastating for women in the region, not tied to any particular religion. But again, the thought process behind this, while very flawed and very disturbing, and it has no place in any society, but it's to hope that a woman is more faithful to her husband, because she really would not want to have any sort of sexual intercourse, any desire for sexual intercourse outside of that of procreation, and because of its painfulness now, because of this. And so that's sort of the thought process that you could define in the book. The book spends actually quite a bit of time talking about this. But again, something to know: polygamy, female genital mutilation, and the division of labor between men and women. Other sociocultural issues: Islam, Christianity, and indigenous beliefs exist in this region as a whole. We know the further you go north, the more Islam influence you would see. Christianity came out of Ethiopia and this particular region before it then came through the missions of different churches that came, the Anglican Church through the British colonies, and Roman Catholicism that came through the French and the Belgians and others, and other religions that play as well, more animist religions or indigenous beliefs, as well as Christianity and Islam, spread and diffused. Sub-Saharan Africa is a predominantly Christian region, unlike that of North Africa, where we saw that difference. Language and ethnicity is present. This divide and rule comes back again, because in Rwanda we have the Hutus and the Tutsis, the Hutus being farmers, the Tutsis being cattle raisers. This is in the 1990s, particularly where things get devastating. The Tutsis were considered to the higher level by the powerful. The Tutsis were to be more powerful, and eventually genocide takes place to kill those that are different, while these are very similar people in their ethnicity, their language, and the space that they occupy. They're pitted against each other in a divide and rule way. Genocide takes place, and 1 million people estimated dead as a result, and many more displaced. Well, I hate to do that again, because the last time we left off on wildebeest and zebras and stuff not making it across a river, and now we leave off on an even more serious issue of genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s. So hopefully we take things and make things a little bit happier, because certainly this is not all doom and gloom. We just happen to leave off on doom and gloom. But Africa, as we see, some of the economic diversification that's taking place, the rapid growth in the cities, the investment coming in from the United States and China and India. Pop culture is alive and well in the music industry and the arts, the food and culture. So there's a lot of promise here that's at play. A lot of hope and excitement surrounding Africa and the tourism, the ecotourism, and the tourism in its cities and its countryside. So again, how about that? We leave off on that good note because we certainly didn't have two good ways to end those slides. So next up, subregions.